Good morning, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Hey, thanks for joining me this morning. Grab a good cup of coffee. Join me over in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. Now, I don't want to confuse you. Yesterday, we were winding up in a passage that's below that, mainly because we flowed from Luke's Gospel into that natural progression. But this is something that's happening around the same time and may have even happened before what we dealt with yesterday, but right there in the same period. So picking this up, we find parallel passage also in Mark 10 that's much shorter and more succinct. But in Matthew 19, we have the details we need from which to give you some great commentary today from the Enduring Word Bible Commentary and several different scholars who've looked at this to have some explanation and background on the passage. But we're going to read it first and then go back and share some of those insights. We begin in verse 1 where it says, "When Jesus had finished saying these things, he departed from Galilee and went to the region of Judea across the Jordan, otherwise called Perea." Verse 2 says, "Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there." So Jesus is still busy healing while he's teaching. But in verse 3, we find here's the little group always following him around. Who are we talking about? The Pharisees, always looking to trap him in something, trying to get him to say something they could criticize. They're always present. So it said some Pharisees approached him to test him, and they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds?" Now, talk about a loaded question. We'll give you the background a little bit to see why it is so loaded. But watch how Jesus responds in verse 4. "Haven't you read?" he replied. And it's when he says, "Haven't you read?" he means in the scriptures, in the Torah in this case. "Haven't you read that he who created them in the beginning made them male and female?" Oh, wow. Is that news to you? Did you not know that God made us with two genders? Yeah, wow. Old truth that sticks today should stick today. God made them male and female. And he also said, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So they are no longer two, but they are one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. There's your basic principle. Now, is there a way to break that principle? Well, verse 7, Pharisees push Jesus on this question. "Why then," they ask him, "did Moses command us to give divorce papers and to send her away?" Now, Jesus immediately catches their misquoting of Moses. Look what he says in verse 8. He told them, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts." But it was not like that from the beginning. No, it was not a command. Nowhere will you find a command in the Bible to divorce your wife in the Torah. No, instead, it's a permission because of things that are happening in sinful human beings. Okay, now verse 9, he says, "But I tell you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." When he gave that permission for divorce, you'll find that in Deuteronomy. It's described as a permission for uncleanness. Well, what Jesus is doing is saying that uncleanness means sexual immorality. It's adultery. That's the uncleanness that it was talking about. And that's the only reason you should legitimately divorce your wife. Now, yes, there are some other circumstances that can be brought into it. And of course, Jesus is not dealing with every little circumstance and every exception. Paul even deals with one of these in 1 Corinthians 7. That is the abandonment of a believing person by their unbelieving spouse. And he says in those cases, that person is free. So as you get to other little exceptions, you can see that there are times where perhaps you've been abused, you've got a spouse that's a criminal, that's done something terrible, that has beat you up or something else. There are some other reasons where it should be considered, but it's not something you have to do. Even broken marriages even broken by adultery, can be restored. So what Jesus is doing is setting a high bar here, and we'll see why it was so controversial because of the thought that was going on in that day. Now, after setting this high bar in verse 10, his disciples said to him, wow, if the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. They say, man, singleness beats this, doesn't it? And Jesus responded, not everyone can accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs, those who are not sexually involved with another person. There are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who are made by men. And there are eunuchs who have been made themselves that way because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who's able to accept it should accept it. Now, what was going on? What were the Pharisees trying to do as far as trapping Jesus in this controversial topic? Well, you just have to go back to what was happening in those days. It said they came testing him. They're not honest. They're hoping to trap Jesus and get him to jump on some bandwagon that they can point to and thereby keep people from following him as Messiah. Now, divorce was a hot topic in Jesus' day with two main schools of thought centered around two of its most famous proponents. The first was the school of Rabbi Shammai, who was the more strict and unpopular view. The second was the school of Rabbi Hillel, and his was the more lax and popular view. Now, see, marriage is important in Jewish culture, should be important in ours as well, but listen to the way they thought. It was a sacred duty of a man to get married to reproduce the next generation. If a man was unmarried after the age of 20, except to concentrate on the study of the law, he was guilty of breaking God's command to be fruitful and multiply. According to Barclay, they said that by not having children, he killed his own descendants and had lessened the glory of God on earth. Now, in theory, the Jews of that day had a very high ideal of marriage, but the problem that Bruce points out is that they didn't have a high view of women. Now, Jesus was breaking this mold everywhere he ministered by the way he treated women and raised their, not just the viewpoint that we should have of women, but raised their status even among his own disciples. Now, watch this. Bruce goes on to say the Jews had a very low view of women. A wife was bought, regarded as property, used as a household drudge, and dismissed at pleasure. Well, things have changed, but they have not changed. Sometimes men today have such a low view of women that they're only an object of sexual pleasure or something else for their own convenience, but never are they elevated to the place that God's word says they should have. So their low view of women in that day meant that their high ideal of marriage was constantly compromised. And those compromises were ultimately made into those laws they added to the law of Moses, as with the thinking of Rabbi Hillel. Under Hillel, a man could divorce his wife, and this is, I'm going to call on Barclay to straighten this out for us. He said a man could divorce his wife if she spoiled his dinner, if she spun, if she went with unbound hair, if she spoke to men in the streets, if she spoke disrespectfully of his parents of his parents in his presence, or if she was a brawling woman who could be heard in the next house. Rabbi Akiba even said that a man could divorce his wife if he just found a woman he liked better and considered more beautiful. So, they basically had said, write your own reason. It's fine, guys. You are in control. Divorce her for any reason. Well, I think perhaps it even goes farther than that. Carson points out that they hoped Jesus would say something that would entangle him in that Herod-Herodias debate so that Jesus might meet the same fate as John the Baptist, who had been beheaded because he dared to call out Herod on his immorality. So what Jesus is doing is saying, look, in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, it talks about divorce, but it says there's got to be uncleanness found in your spouse, in your wife, for you to divorce her. And Jesus basically put that in perspective. He said what he meant was adultery. It's got to be that breaking of the union by going and having a sexual relationship with someone that is not your spouse. That's really the only legitimate reason. The other reasons involve straightening out relationships and helping people find out how to act properly to keep the marriage together if at all possible. Now, yeah, there were those times when that wasn't possible. Paul even points that out in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 when he talks about the issue of a believing spouse having an unbelieving spouse to leave them and abandon them. And he says in that case, that person is free. So Jesus, as he lays this out, he's trying to break this difference between the two schools of rabbinical thoughts. And some of these, I could go on and on about some of the stories that they said in the day about wives. It would just break your heart to see that some of these people were treating their wives this way. One of the sayings, I'll pull one of these out for you. They said that a bad wife is like leprosy to her husband, and the only way he could be cured is by divorce. Matter of fact, they even put it this way: if a man has a bad wife, it's his religious duty to divorce her. So they made it way too easy, my friends. And Jesus said, that's not the way God meant this to be. He said, you need to love one another and stick together as best you can and make that relationship as godly as you can, because that's the way our Father intended it from the beginning. We could go on about that, but we are out of time. You have a great day in the Lord, and we'll see you next time right here when we wake up in God's Word.